Welcome everyone to this analysis of the poem To My Father by Tony Curtis. At this point you've already watched my other videos analysing From Father to Son by Emyr Humphreys. This is very much the counterpart to those videos. After all, the whole point of your poetry comparison is to compare the presentation of the same theme in two different poems. Before we begin our analysis, it's important that we understand the exact question that we are going to be completing for our non-examination assessment. This is the title that you will be given. To My Father by Tony Curtis and From Father to Son by Emyr Humphreys are both about the poets' adult memories of their fathers. Compare the way they present these memories. Notice how the word compare is used deliberately, because that needs to be the main focus of our essay. What I would like us to cover in this video is to understand stanza 1 of To My Father by Tony Curtis. I'll go over the other stanzas in due course, but let's focus today on stanza 1. Before we look at the poem itself, I just want to introduce you to Tony Curtis and share a little bit of his context. It's very important to realise that context is not part of the mark scheme. There are no marks for understanding the role of the family of the real Tony Curtis. However, knowing a little bit about his real experiences, I think, gives a little bit more illumination to the words we see on the page. Now, Curtis experienced a really tumultuous relationship with his real father. And this was a subject that he talked about in quite a few of his poems. The main reason why he felt frustration with his father is because there was a feeling that his father had deliberately concealed details of his life from Curtis and their wider family. Now, these details centred on his father's reticence regarding his work during World War II, which was a cause of some considerable frustration to Curtis. If we think back to the context of Emyr Humphreys, Humphreys' father also returned from World War II and found it very difficult to communicate with his son. What we will see in these two poems is that breakdown of communication and that breakdown of that paternal relationship is what causes a lot of pain and frustration in their adulthood. Before I start the analysis, I'd like to first of all read the poem to you once, and then we'll start having a look at the first stanza. To My Father by Tony Curtis. Bell ringing was another of the things you didn't teach me. How many crooked ladders did we climb? How many belfries did we crouch in? The musty smell of the years in the wood beams, the giant domes balanced to move against a man's pull. Stories of jammed trapdoors and madness in the deafening that draws blood. Once you rang for the Queen, and I watched all that pomp ooze into the cold stone of the cathedral. I wanted to take the smooth grip of a rope and lean my weight into it. I wanted timing. I wanted you to teach me, to teach my son's son. Turning your back on that brings our line down. What have you left me? What sense of the past? I could have lost myself in the mosaic of grandsires, trebles and bobs, moved to that clip calling of the changes. I know now the church bells is coming over the folded towns. Sunday sleep carries me close to tears. The noise of worship and weddings and death rolling out, filling the hollow of my throat. Let's take a look at the title first. As we do this, I'd like you to think about the title of From Father to Son. It shares some fairly clear similarities, but also some differences too. To My Father begins with the word to. And that word to is directly addressing his father through that preposition. Now, in From Father to Son, the poet does frequently use the second person pronoun you. This poem, however, is far more direct, and therefore it gives us perhaps a little bit more of a personal relationship being presented. I feel like in the other poem it was much more passive, whilst this is much more direct. It develops a more accusatory, interrogative tone. From the very beginning of this poem, I think we see a son who is angry at their father, who is let down by their father, who is disappointed with their father. And you can feel that frustration from the very direct use of the word to. The statement at the start of this is a declarative statement. We then move on to the word my. If we identify my as a first person possessive pronoun, we can hear a real feeling of disappointment that the father that Curtis was given did not match up to the expectation of what a father should be. The word father, in this case the noun father, normally fathers have connotations of love and intimacy and protection and closeness. However, much like the father in Humphreys' poem, the poet doesn't feel like he has been given the type of father that he feels like he is deserving of. If we take a look at this title, I think you'll see it's far more direct, whilst the title of From Father to Son is a little more passive. The first stanza begins, "Bell ringing was another of the things you didn't teach me." The poet selects the word bell ringing as the first word of his poem. Now, bell ringing is a skill passed down from one generation to the next. It could be a symbol of the divide between father and son here, because the noise of bell ringing drowns out everything else. If there are bells ringing, then you cannot speak or listen to each other. This is something I'd like to pick out as a reminder of From Father to Son. The breakdown of communication was clear in From Father to Son. There was a muteness. The father and the child could not speak to each other in honest and open terms. Here, the son does not have the ability to make these bells sing. The reason why he cannot make these bells ring is because he wasn't given the gift of bell ringing that his father could have passed down from one generation to the next. The word another, I think, is worthy of our comment here. This suggests that there are a number of things that the father has neglected to pass on to his son. I think this fuels that sense of disappointment and frustration from the son. I think he feels completely let down and that his father did not accept the role of being a father. We then have the fairly negative term of the things you didn't teach me. There's a sense here that the poet feels his father has been neglecting his responsibilities. This poem identifies all of the things that the father did not do. When we take a look at the word teach, we show that the son in this poem is desperate to learn from his father. He wants to engage. He desires that communication. He wants the experiences of learning from his father, and yet was denied them. I think this is similar to Emyr Humphreys' poem, where both of the men desired communication, but neither of them were able to pass that divide. The first line ends with the word me. Here we have that first person pronoun. I think the word you and the word me, both of which are pronouns, shows a clear distance between these two people. They were completely different in their desires. One wanted to learn, the other one didn't want to teach. This reminds me of From Father to Son. In the title From Father to Son, their prepositions from and to show a clear distance between these two figures. Here, the words you and me are deliberately kept separated, showing that they were never able to form a close relationship. That first full sentence ending at that second line ends with an end stopped line. That full stop is deliberately used after the word me. I think that shows the sense of disappointment, the sense that his father could have achieved something and yet decided not to pass on those skills to his son. We then have the next two lines, and you'll notice instantly that they look very, very similar. How many crooked ladders did we climb? How many belfries did we crouch in? Both of these lines begin with the same phrase. How many? How many in this case means we have anaphora being used. The beginning of these lines begin with the interrogative word how. The sentences themselves are interrogatives. For me, that shows that he is desperate for an answer. He is demanding an answer from his father. It shows his frustration, it shows his resentment, and it also shows that he deserved better. After all, he had invested effort in climbing these crooked ladders and crouching in belfries. He feels like his efforts should have been reciprocated. Unfortunately, the father did not reciprocate. We then move on to the pre-modifying adjective crooked. The word crooked is describing ladders in this case. However, might that crooked also describe the relationship between these father and the son? If we know the word crooked means to be deformed or broken or no longer showing support, I think we can see that the relationship, much like the ladders being described, is also broken and inadequate. The word ladders gives us a sense of a perhaps metaphorical meaning. It may symbolize the relationship as broken and problematic. Perhaps much like a ladder, when one person climbs it, they get further away from the person at the bottom. It could show that greater distance between father and son. Ladders are supposed to support the person who is climbing. Perhaps Curtis feels like as he ascends his ladder or as he moves through life, he should have the support of his father, and yet that ladder, that support, is not there for him to fall back on. The end of these sentences also end in a similar way. Both of these lines are rhetorical questions. Those repeated rhetorical questions could show a constant feeling of crushing disappointment. He never gets an answer to these questions. He is denied that answer, perhaps because of the lack of communication from his father, or, just like in Humphreys' poem, perhaps this person will never get the resolution they need because the father has now gone and therefore cannot answer those questions. The repeated rhetorical questions gives us that sense of accusation. This person is demanding answers because they are angry, frustrated, and disappointed. Where it says that how many belfries did we crouch in, the word crouch could be a suggestion of being uncomfortable. If you crouch somewhere, you may not feel like you completely belong there. It's uncomfortable. It's perhaps painful. Perhaps Curtis is suggesting that this relationship was always one that was uncomfortable, and he had to try and tolerate it as best as he could, hoping that one day he would get the relief. If we take a look at the two personal pronouns, they are first person plural pronouns in this case, this could show that they were in really close proximity during their life. They were both very close, part of the same unit. But perhaps they never actually engaged. There's a sense here that this distance got greater and greater, much like the distance that formed between Emyr Humphreys and his father after the father returned from the war. Let's focus next on the word musty. Musty in this case is a pre-modifying adjective. It is describing the smell that comes later. Here we have connotations of neglect. The musty smell could be seen as one of stagnation and staleness, and I think this could be indicative of the relationship that the father and the son had. It seemed to have stagnated, it seemed to have stayed still for a very long time and never improved in the way that Curtis would have liked. We then have the phrase, the musty smell of the years in the wood beams. Now here we get a piece of imagery that I would like to define as olfactory imagery. Olfactory imagery is imagery associated with the smells. And I think that is used here to haunt the poetic voice. Much like in Emyr Humphreys' poem, he was haunted by the memory of his father, and he couldn't touch his father, he couldn't regain a relationship with his father, and he couldn't bring his father truly back to life. Here, the smell, I think, is showing a decaying relationship. Just like wood beams that are rotting away, perhaps this relationship has been in decline for a long period of time. There could also be a suggestion that neither father or son were able to treat their relationship and fix that rot. The imagery used at the end of the line, wood beams, has connotations of strength and support. Much like the imagery used in both of the poems that we're looking at, the word father may suggest strength and support. It may show intimacy and love and feelings of undying devotion. Here, these wood beams that are smelling musty are suggesting of decay and rot and perhaps flaking away after years and years of neglect. Perhaps much like wood beams rot and lose their strength and lose their power, the relationship between the father and the son has decayed over time and is now something completely weak and ready to break. The next part of the line says the giant domes. The giant domes here could be seen as a metaphor. The giant domes literally are bells, the bells that have been referred to from the very beginning of the poem. However, these giant domes, using the pre-modifying adjective giant and the noun domes, could be a symbol for the relationship between these two people. Now, domes are enormous empty spaces. This cavernous emptiness might symbolize the emptiness of their relationship. Perhaps the emptiness of those bells are just like the emptiness of the relationship between father and son. Now, bells could make incredibly loud and powerful noises. The relationship between father and son could be powerful. However, here, these bells are still, they are silent, and that could hint at a lack of communication. What could be thriving is suggested here as silence. You might want to take a look at the imagery used in the coat image in Emyr Humphreys' poem. That also suggests a lack of communication and a muteness. We then have the word balanced. The word balanced may show that these bells could easily be made to sing, much like his father would have chosen to engage and communicate. Balanced might also show how precarious their relationship is. It has been toppled by the lack of engagement as the father refused to move towards his son. I would suggest here that the son is making noise. The son is shouting, the son is trying to get some sort of communication from his father. And yet, even though it would be simple for these bells to start to sing, for the father to start to speak, they don't speak because somebody is not pulling that rope. And the suggestion here is that it is the father who must make that first move, and yet he is incapable of doing so. The final part of the sentence, against a man's pull, we might look at the word against and show that there is a resistance and a reticence of the father to bridge the gap to his son. To pull the bell, to drag that rope down, would move something closer. If you have two men at the end of a rope and one is pulling incredibly hard, then the other person gets closer. Perhaps the son feels like he is pulling the rope and the father is not responding. Just like somebody pulling a bell and the bell does not sing. The word against, I think, is again hinting at an increasing distance, and that distance is seen all the way through Emyr Humphreys' poem. Taking a look at the start of the next line, it begins with the word stories. Now, if we think about stories, stories are told from one person who experienced something to someone who didn't experience it. They're passing on that story, sharing what they've done. Now, in this context, we can see that the son is hearing of the events that his father took place in, but crucially, he wasn't there. Again, that signals the distance between father and son. He seems to be an outsider looking in at his father and looking in at the experience that took place. And he seems to be looking in longingly, desperate that he could join his father in that memory. And yet he always seems to be locked out of that memory. He never gets to share what his father experienced. And that's exemplified at the end of this stanza. If we take a look at the two words jammed and trapdoors. Now, the word jammed here is describing the word trapped doors, which makes jammed a pre-modifying adjective. And the word jammed is showing literally how this trapdoor cannot open. However, this trapdoor could be seen as a metaphor for their relationship. And if you consider the imagery of a door that is trapped shut, we could consider that no matter how hard the son tries, he simply cannot force his father to open up, just like a jammed trapdoor cannot open. That closed imagery is worthy of consideration when we look at Emyr Humphreys' poem too. If you take a look at the word madness, here we could consider madness being exciting and chaotic as they're talking about all of the fantastic stories that the father had of his bell ringing. It could also hint that he is aware that his father has been affected psychologically by the war. The word madness could be a link to the illnesses of war. Where it says in the deafening that draws blood, we could consider deafening as another allusion to being unable to hear. Perhaps this again signifies the inability for the son to be heard by his father. We've got a cacophony of bell ringing that is described at the beginning of this poem. That could also hint at the similarly chaotic sounds of war that he cannot escape. Where it says that draws blood, here we've got a fairly violent piece of imagery. Now this could symbolize their inability to communicate continues to cause pain and suffering. It seems to be killing their relationship. If we take a look at those two lines metaphorically, it could again symbolize how their relationship was one that was entirely closed off and could not be opened. As we move on to the final 3 lines of the stanza, you'll notice that we have again a separation of the second personal pronoun you and the first person pronoun I. Once again, we see that these two men are not in unity. They seem to be completely separate entities, and they simply cannot engage with each other. The son feels isolated and distant, and you can see that through the use of pronouns in these final 3 lines. We could link that really clearly to Emyr Humphreys' poem. Throughout the poem, Emyr Humphreys uses the word you instead of me or I. And that seems to be deliberate in showing that there is a disconnect between them in their relationship. The words "and I watched" here is written in an isolated line. And that could also highlight the feeling of isolation. Notice how in the line before, there seems to be this reverence for his father, this respect for his father about what his father achieved by ringing for the queen. And yet, the use of enjambment here allows us to see the separation from the father who is doing the interesting activity and the son who is forced into watching. Watching is an inactive verb here, and it shows how he is not allowed to share the experiences with his father. He is excluded from bell ringing, but also he seems to be excluded from a close relationship with him. It continues that imagery of being locked out. The final line of the stanza says, "All that pomp ooze into the cold stone of the cathedral." The word pomp here could show the frustration from the son at how his father can invest effort and enthusiasm in celebrating the queen through his bell ringing, but he cannot invest it into his relationship. The word pomp here evokes that warm imagery of passion and enthusiasm, and yet that changes into cold imagery as the line progresses. The verb ooze transitions this image from one of warmth and pride into one of emptiness and coldness. This verb shows that slow, creeping loss of energy, perhaps signifying how the relationship continued to decline without the father trying to stem the flow. The imagery used with cold stone is in direct juxtaposition with the warmth that was used previously. And this is a type of technique that Emyr Humphreys uses throughout his poem. There's lots of juxtaposition between warmth and coldness. Here, the noun stone has connotations of hardness, coldness, and being resistant. Perhaps that signifies the father, and how that father was almost stone-like in the way that he treated his son. A lack of emotion, a lack of warmth, and a lack of care. The final word of this stanza is the word cathedral, and if we think of the imagery of cathedrals, we often think of cathedrals as places where people can get together and they can celebrate major achievements in life, from weddings to christenings, and perhaps even celebrating someone's life for a funeral. However, cathedrals are also very large, very empty places, often quite cold. Now, this could symbolize how their relationship could have been one to thank God for. However, it's one of loneliness instead. Perhaps that cathedral is a metaphor for the relationship between these two men. By just focusing on this first stanza, you can now see multiple areas where this poem is both similar and different to Emyr Humphreys' poem. It would be worth you looking at both poems once more, tracking some of those similarities and differences from the language choices to technique, and making notes ready for your non-examination assessment. Thank you so much for watching this video. Take a look at the next video that will be analysing stanza 2. This video is not supposed to replace your own interpretation, your own understanding of the poem, so please feel free to branch out and use my suggestions as starting points.